Ready?
Yeah.
We're ready? Good,
Respected
good.
guests, esteemed faculty, beloved students, and cherished members of Voices from the Periphery, is with the deepest humility and profound reverence that we gather today to welcome a voice whose life and work have been more witness to some of the most difficult yet essential stories of our shared humanity, Sir Hank Greenspan. To introduce him is to honor a lifetime devoted not only to scholarship, but also to listening, remembering, and accompanying survivors of unimaginable trauma with compassion and courage. And Greenspan, psychologist, playwright, and oral historian, has spent decades in conversation with Holocaust survivors, not merely recording their testimonies, but entering into enduring relationships that honor the depth and complexity of their lives. His work reminds us memory is not a static archive, but a living, breathing dialogue, an ongoing act of bearing witness that resists erasure and refuses silence. Through his moving play Remnants, as well as his countless writings and interviews, the Greenspan has given form to the stories that might otherwise have remained unsaid. But more than that, he has taught us to listen is itself an ethical act, an act of solidarity, humility, and profound human recognition. He has insisted that survivors are not only the bearers of trauma, but also of creativity and overall is simply kind of ethical act and resilience, wisdom, that their voice must not be read out by symbols, but must be encountered in all their endurable pureness. Today's session, Remnants of a Life Among Holocaust Survivors, is not simply a performance, not merely a lecture. It is an invitation to accompany Sir Greenspan into the fragile yet powerful spaces where memory meets presence, where history meets humanity. For Voices from the Periphery, Sir Greenspan works resonates deeply with our own calling to create spaces where the marginalized, the silenced, and the displaced can speak, and where we can learn not just to hear, but to listen. His presence here is both a privilege and a profound provocation to ask ourselves how we too might become more attentive witness to the stories around us. On behalf of everyone gathered here, with utmost respect and gratitude, we extend our warmest welcome to Sir Hank Greenspan. May today's performance and conversation move us to deeper reflection, deeper listening, and deeper commitment to justice and humanity. Up to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Right, that was perfect. You already said everything I would say. So the only difference is I'm saying it instead of you, but otherwise you've conveyed the essence of what's been important to me, and I'm honored, obviously, that you did, that you said it, and obviously to be here. I'm going to take just 1 second to ask my friend Ed, who just appeared on screen. Ed, would you mind turning your video off? It's slightly distracting just because you're moving around. I appreciate that. Thank you. Anyway, it is, as I said, a great honor to be here. And a surprise, I will say. Here's what I mean. I knew the program is called Voices from the Periphery, and I would have guessed that from the perspective of India, and tells you how ignorant I probably am of India, which is true. Like a lot of Americans, we don't know much in reality. I mean, obviously some people do, but many don't. But my sense was that because it's true that certainly since the 1980s, survivors have become almost celebrities, if I can put it that way, in the United States. Whenever a survivor does something significant, it's usually a headline of some kind, a survivor, etc. That I wouldn't think of them, and I think most people in the U.S. wouldn't think of them as an peripheral. Almost the opposite. They would think of them as very celebrated and honored people, which, of course, makes a lot of sense in certain ways. As Ash suggested, though, sometimes one can honor people without actually engaging them. In fact, honors sometimes do that. When you turn people into celebrities of a certain kind, you may symbolically um, appreciate who they are and what they did and what they lived. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you engage them as particular people. I would say over the years and in general, that survivors are us. Survivors are us. There's no essential difference between ourselves and survivors of the Holocaust or other horrors in the world that we all know of, other genocides, torture, and so on, other kinds of grotesque oppression. Um, the difference, obviously, is that we personally, hopefully, hopefully, didn't go through such hells, but that doesn't make them different kinds of human beings. That keeps them our brothers and sisters who unfortunately had to experience such madness. Fortunately for them, individually, in small groups, they're still with us, or they were after. But of course, the great majority in genocides are not still with us, and were never still with us because, by definition, they were destroyed. They were erased from the planet. So the survivors are here or were here. The great majority were not. And those who were and are, every other way except, again, if we, assuming we didn't have the bad fortune of going through hell like that, they're us. And when we put people on pedestals, it sometimes turns out to be as distancing as when we put them, if this will mean anything, in the clinic, the poor babies, the sort of injured people, and so on. It's another way of keeping people over there somewhere, whether it's the pedestal or, as I sometimes say, the consulting room, like the doctor's office. There's still those Holocaust people. They become symbols in a way, or almost archetypes of the event. They're those, quote, Holocaust people. I'll give you a very specific example. During the COVID epidemic, here and, of course, around the world, and especially there, actually, in India. In the New York Times, during the early part of the pandemic, they had a list of people from New York who died during the pandemic. And they had the name, they had what borough, what part of the city they lived in, and they had occupation. And believe it or not, for Holocaust survivors, the occupation that was listed was not what people were: doctors, shopkeepers, dressmakers, etc., whatever that was. The occupation was listed as Holocaust survivor. It's amazing, isn't it? As though they lived in order to be Holocaust survivors, as though that was their job. It was not their job to be Holocaust survivors. They were, but their job was to be whatever job they had, etc. So that at least told me something about the ways that we confuse the individual people with whatever history they may have endured and turn them into symbols of that history. Understandable in a way, because, of course, when we begin to learn about such horrors, we become scared, we become awed, we become, um, overwhelmed in a way. And so we start to associate the person with the history, but they're not. The history is the history, the person is the person who remains alive to reflect on what happened, to tell us what happened, but they're not the history itself. So I think we do easily get confused, and I think the reason it matters is because if survivors are those, quote, Holocaust people, then it has nothing to do with us exactly. It has to do with them. Oh, they were there. They're part of that. That doesn't make them part of us necessarily. And the key, whether it's this history or other horrific histories, is that we see them. This is human history, ultimately. As specific as that may be, whether the targeted groups are Jews, or it doesn't matter what group it is. They're all us. This is human history in that sense, while being specific history, Rwandan history, uh, European history, wherever. Ultimately, it is about human history. And that's been, as you're hearing, probably in my tone as well as my words, something that I've been very committed to. So, this making survivors in a way special, but not necessarily in a useful way, in a real way, was not the way it was early on. And if we talk about people on the periphery, on the margins, and so on, that was more literally true during the first 25, even 30 years after the war. Um, some quick examples from people, some I know, some you'll have heard of perhaps. Elie Wiesel, who won the Nobel Prize, was quite well known, of course, in the world, wrote in the 1970s, talking about survivors. As they re entered the world, they found themselves in another kind of exile, another kind of prison. People welcomed them, then turned away. One treated them as one would sick and needy relatives, or as specimens to be observed. They were disturbing misfits who deserved charity, but nothing else. Abe Pasternak, one of the survivors, some of whose reflections are included in my play Remnants, and you'll hear one of the segments that comes from Abe. He's named Manny in the piece, but it comes from Abe, someone I've known for, I knew for over 30 years, um, said, remembered after the war, and you'll hear versions of this in the monologue from the play. He said, people would meet me and they'd say, oh, did you know that he was in a concentration camp? And that's all it was left to. Nobody asked about it. It was pity. And that was that. My uncle would introduce me. You know, he was in a concentration camp. And that was it. Yeah? So he and the concentration camp were effectively the same thing, or part of the same thing. It wasn't himself. He was the nephew from the concentration camp. As Wiesel said, a kind of a specimen to be observed or feared, not an actual fellow human being. One more of these kinds of reflections. This is Aggie Rubin, a survivor who is in everything that I write and speak about this topic. She and I were, you know, the cliche applies. We were indeed like family. We were very, very close. We wrote a book together. We spent a lot of time together, not just formally talking about the war, but having dinner and going on trips and being together over holidays. She remembered in those years, again, the first almost 30, Aki said, everybody said, this is to forget. Hush up your bad dreams. We were ashamed. We were made to feel ashamed. So I covered up. I'm fine, Joe. How are you? We tried to get along, you know. I'm an American too. You understand? It happens, the very first survivor I interviewed, which goes all the way back to 1970, I won't go through the whole story, but I was working on a different project and we got onto this topic. I didn't even know that he was a survivor. He told me in the midst of an interview that was a regular psych research project. And it turned out almost accidentally that he was a survivor. So he ended up speaking for 9 hours, which sort of set a pattern. I became known as someone whose interviews went on forever, not only in individual sessions, but over years and years and years. But he told me, among other things, that I was the first, quote, American, meaning born in the U.S., after the war, barely, about 3 years after the war, with whom he'd ever spoken about his experiences during the Holocaust, ever. I was to hear that many times from people, as you're now guessing. But at the time, you know, it was a surprise. I couldn't, here we are, 25 years after liberation, after the end of the war, and I'm the first American? How could that be? Well, it, as I said, turns out to be quite common that was true. Survivors very often talked among themselves. They talked about their experiences and shared them among themselves, but not to quote outsiders. And in those days, people like me were effectively outsiders. And the assumption was that we wouldn't understand, and even more that we would be uninterested, or we would turn them into specimens of some kind. I can't resist telling you another quick Abe story. When I first spoke with him, also in that early period, he knew I was a psychologist. I was actually in training, and he said, "So Hank, you're a psychologist. So do you think we're crazy?" I love talking about Abe. He was a funny man, and he I treaded water. What do I say? And then Abe, as usual, he came to my rescue. He said, "Of course we're crazy. You'd have to be crazy to go through something like that and not be crazy." But he wasn't crazy in any, quote, usual psychological sense. He did fear, as he called it, his inner Nazis. He feared that he could lose everything again. He feared whether it was his family, his friends, his business, his whole way of life. But is that crazy? That's what happened. That's literally what happened. He lost everything. So, in a way, it would be crazy not to fear that it could happen again. And I will add this note: in our particular time, in this particular historical moment, in the US and elsewhere, the fear of, quote, it happening again, or some version of it happening again, um, not to mention the ways it's already happening, would not be crazy. It would be, in a way, crazy not to fear that, not to have nightmares about the possibility of all of that coming back. Okay. So then the question becomes, if we didn't well engage survivors in the early years, and as you hear my saying, even later, not as well as we think we sometimes do, I put it that way, then what does it mean? And I don't want to overdo this because I want to get to something very important that's happening today, which is, I should have mentioned earlier, but three of the folks here, or I should say the folks there, are doing me the great honor of reciting three of the monologues from Remnants. And so I want to get to that soon. But I think it would be helpful to give a little bit of idea of my practice, what I call my practice, how I engage people. And that's partly because it's a little different than some of what you may assume, because there's been a certain framework for what's usually called gathering the testimony of Holocaust survivors. It's usually 2 or 3 hours in front of a video camera, and that goes into an archive, and usually with a stranger, someone the survivor doesn't know beforehand. And that's the end of it. It's not the way I worked. And one of the reasons I didn't work that way was because that way, for the most part, didn't yet exist. In the 1970s, when I started, that was still to be developed. Oh, there were some early projects that had to do with gathering survivors' accounts, but not with video cameras, and not in the format that's become essentially, well, almost universal. Not quite, but almost. So the fact that that didn't yet exist meant that survivors and I were free to, in essence, make it up as we went along. We could kind of wing it and do what we chose to do. And one of the things that we chose to do was to meet as often and as long as it seemed mutually useful to do. So that could mean several times over the course of a few months. It could mean several times over the course of years with some people, and with a few people to get to know each other and continue the conversation and deepen the conversation over literally decades. Now, that's just a few people. Abe being one of them, Augie, whom you've heard, being another. People I really got to know, as you would assume. When you know people like that, when you know people really well as human beings, as fellow human beings, not only are they not symbols of the history, but it's not like every time we got together, we talked about the war. That was in the background. But talking about the war and so on was in the context of full relationships. So we would talk about everything effectively. Um, and the war was knit into the full relationship as human beings um, who've living our different lives. They would learn something about my life, of course. I would learn about theirs in a broader sense than only what happened in certain years. Important, obviously, as those years were. So it made a difference. In other, I'm not going to go through here all the differences it made, but it made. I'll mention a couple. Um, another part of my quote practice, part of what I did, especially early, was I made my own transcriptions of my interviews. Now, any of you who've made transcriptions know that a single hour of an interview can add up to what, 10 hours if you want to get all the errors out. So, you know, it's very time consuming, but on the other hand, it has great payoff. And one of those is that you really, first of all, when you really listen to your own interviewing, then you really listen. You know, we're at a time, and maybe it's been a while for some time, that the whole notion of deep listening has become a thing. You know, it's much celebrated. I would say it's also like a lot of things kind of sentimentalized. Oh, there, here's how you really do deep listening. Well, in my experience, deep listening is really about re-listening. Yeah, it's going back, and if something is recorded, of course, that's the most obvious way to re-listen to your original listen. In other words, to listen to the listening. And there's a sort of paradox here. Even in a really good interview, first of all, there are always roads that you miss. There are always things that you wish you'd said and didn't, or wish you hadn't said and did. Yeah. None of us, we're all backseat interviewers. When we listen to our own or other interviews, we always hear things that might have been different. When you're in the midst of an interview, it's very hard to notice those things. It's almost impossible. And ironically, the better an interview, meaning the more you're connected between you and that person you're interviewing, in a way, the harder it is to stand back and hear what you are and are not hearing because you're responding in the moment. So, my argument has been deep listening is kind of a fancy way of talking about re listening. And that's not easy to romanticize. That's hard, painstaking, time consuming work to re listen. Yeah. Especially in transcription. Um, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. It's not glamorous, but I believe, well, I learned a lot from doing that. One thing I learned, of course, is that indeed how much I wished I'd asked or clarified, knowing I would, in most cases, have a next interview with a survivor meant I could go back. I had the opportunity to clarify, to revisit some of what I may have missed the first time. So that was really important. Another thing that came out of it was that in that process of listening, especially transcribing, where you're listening again and again and again to the same short segment to get it right in your transcription, you really hear not only what people say, but how they say it. You know, I know Sandro Portelli, one of my favorite people, was a speaker in this series. And Portelli is a wonderful guy. And among other things, he writes about the orality, as he calls it. You know, the rhythms of speech, the music of speech. So it's not just the words, but it's how people use silence, how people use rhythm pausing, the velocity, the speed of speech, or conversely, the emphases, times where they slow down, times where they get louder, softer. All of those dimensions of speech, the physical dimensions of speech, are, as in my view, and this is partly a psychologist bias. None of this was therapy, by the way, for anybody. However, one is sensitized to rhythm as being part of the communication. So not only the what, but the how of speech. And the other consequence immediately was that when it came time, which was almost 20 years into my work with survivors, I was not intending to write a play that arose as it did. Um, but I had already almost internalized an orchestra of different voices. So I knew what these survivors, quote, sounded like. I didn't only know them, but I knew how they spoke, at least with me. I had an idea of where the pauses were likely to be. I had an idea of how they emphasized certain things, etc. So that turned out to be very, very useful when I came to writing a dramatic work. But these were not just characters to me, like in a play, but people I really knew in a way from the inside, not because I shared their experiences, obviously I didn't. But as humans, as fellow humans, I had a sense of their style, of who they were as people in that sense. Now, finally, another thing about um, this practice is that short way in, I realized I could do something that hadn't occurred to me before, which is that I could bring short segments from prior interviews, places where I thought, yeah, there was something I didn't quite understand, or we could clarify more. I could bring excerpts from my audio tapes. I always used audio, not video, um, to the next interview, short segments, and the survivors and I could pour over them together. I would say something like, we were talking about this, and I wasn't sure I understood something. Can we talk about that and revisit? And we did. And I will say, and I can't think of a case that it wasn't true that survivors love doing that, to sit together and work together over a particular segment of a prior interview. Another one of those words, like deep listening, that I think is much romanticized or sentimentalized in a lot of work that calls itself oral history or whatever it calls itself, um, is collaboration. Words like collaboration or co-construction, or the notion of people working together, which of course is a good thing. But this is collaboration very concretely, very literally. It is laboring together, yeah, laboring together in order to get somewhere that was new, that was different, in a very specific way. Now, that had many consequences, as you would assume. We got used to working together. It opened up a kind of a candor and a working relationship that took different forms with different people, but was very important in terms of going further and perhaps reaching places that we would not have reached otherwise. But I want to, again, I always quote my beloved Aggie Rubin because she always says it better than anybody, including me. Here's how she described not only interviews like that with me, but with some other people too. She said, one thought sparks another that I may not have even known I had. That's the part that is so gratifying. Whatever I think I'm teaching, I'm learning at the same moment. We're learning together. Learning together. That's, if there's one short phrase, two words that summarize, again, what I've tried to do. It's learning together. And I would say that's true certainly in my work with survivors, but it's also true in my teaching. It's true, it can never be as intimate, but it's true with an audience after the play. It's true in life to the extent I can facilitate that happening. Maybe ideally it'll be true a little bit today. And when I say, and when she said learning together, very important to hear her saying thoughts that I may not have even known I had or that she didn't have. Um, and then it's gratifying. And one could ask, my goodness, she's talking about the Holocaust. How could that be gratifying? What's gratifying is exactly the process of learning together. And if you think, I think a number of you are students or certainly have been, and you think about the best seminars that you've ever had in school. And my guess is the most memorable moments was when your seminar was cooking, was really just rolling along. And people would say things and they wouldn't just throw out ideas that were already in their head. They would listen to each other, build on what other people said, work together, and come to places that were in nobody's head going in, right? New knowledge, new insight, new perspective that people did not come in with. That's learning together. And that is, even about sad things, that's exhilarating. Yeah? So that's, I think, what Augie meant about those times. I know we're getting to time. So to say this, learning together about, um, like oral history in general, my interviews tended to begin with what happened during the war. Um, and that was, for me, the beginning. It wasn't the end. Talking about, as it is in most testimony interviews, fine, that's for the archive, that's for the record, that's usually historical record. But for me, I think of it and thought of it more as exploration than declaration. When I say that, I mean every aspect of these experiences were part of what we discussed. So not only what happened during the war, but how people thought about how did that affect them? How did they get up in the morning? Did they think it could happen again? Did they think others can understand what they experienced? Have they tried to talk with other people? How did it go? Did they say different things to different people? Did they learn when and where it made sense to talk about it and when not to? And on and on and on. Do they believe in humanity? Do they believe in divinity? Faith issues. So, yes, it was oral history, sort of, but it was no less oral psychology, oral theology, oral philosophy, even some oral politics, political science, uh, and so on. So, the oral history defined narrowly was only a part of that. And finally, for this part, um, another thing that happens, and this happens with anybody whom you get to know well, a friend, a close acquaintance. Every now and then, our friend will say something quite extraordinary about an experience, serious experience usually, a loss, a journey, an illness that they've gone through. But at these times, they find an image, maybe just a cadence of voice, maybe a new memory, but something that seems to just nail it. It seems to get to the heart, the essence of that experience. Yeah? So these are gifts. When this happens, very often the person who said that thing, that amazing moment, tears. It's like a release. It's not necessarily, and often isn't, because whatever they're remembering and saying is sad, I think, but because it's true. It's as true as they can say it in that moment. And that itself is a release. And even more, or in addition to actually finding that way of saying it, is the fact that they know there was someone who heard it. So they're not alone with it, that particular insight. And I say this because the play, from which you're about to hear some segments, is itself a trajectory, is itself a grouping of those kinds of moments. So it's not typical speech, it's not everyday speech. It's a series of these very condensed, in a way, very precise times when people came to that particular sort of insight. So well, I sometimes think of it as almost like a time capsule. These small moments that are enormous gifts. So I will stop there for the moment and welcome three of my friends there to share some of the segments from the play. Of course, they'll not be acting. Even when I do it, I'm not sure I'm acting, but they'll be reciting, speaking some of it, and then we'll come back and um, do it a little bit at the end and then welcome your questions. in whatever form. So, however, I do this, but turn over the floor to people there who do the reciting. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, for sharing with us such a session, this is a both profoundly moving and deeply grounding. Now, for today, we will, now, as you said earlier, we will recite some of the portion of your play, and we carry forward of your presence here, not only inside, but an an ethic of listening with humility, with the spirit in our hearts. We now move into the next part to this gathering, the
Mhm.
performance of payments drawn from your decades of working alongside Holocaust survivors. This is not simply theater, but memory brought to life. My, I will play a significant role, and other two was Pallav and Rakhi. So,
Great.
so can we start?
Please. Please.
So, Pallav,
Yes. Can I start?
Yeah. I mean, for me,
Thank you.
we can't see you. At least I can't. But
Okay. So, Mars. In the beginning, right after the war, we wanted to talk about it. I mean, if we could talk about it, we wanted to talk about it. We needed to talk about it. I wanted to talk about it a lot, but nobody wants to hear. Like, when I first came to this country, nobody wanted to hear about the hollow. I mean, nobody wanted to hear about it. My own cousin, a dentist in California, I met when I first came over here. He said to me almost the first thing he said, Manny, I know what you went through. I saw the newsreels. I don't want to hear a word about it. That's what he said to me. I saw the newsreels. But you know, a funny thing. To me, a funny thing I noticed that made me think maybe they did see something. This was 1947, 2 years after the war, and I noticed there were reports coming out. The first ones about unidentified flying objects. Yeah, this was the beginning of all that with the Martians and the flying saucers in 1947. Suddenly, in 1947, all these unidentified flying objects were showing up. And then, just like they see today, some people were saying they saw the people from inside the spaceship. Yeah, just like they say today. They said they saw the people who were coming from Mars, and the people they saw had big bald heads, and they had skinny arms and skinny legs, and large eyes, almost large eyes, in those big heads on those skinny little bodies. Now I said to myself, I have seen these people before. Yeah, I have seen these people before. I have seen those thin, tiny, skinny bodies. I have seen those bald heads bobbing up and down. I have seen those large eyes, eyes that were everywhere, staring. Eyes sees everything, seeing nothing. Yeah, I have seen these people before. And my cousin, the dentist in California, he had also seen these people before. He saw them in the newsreels. I saw them on Mars.
thank you.
really select. You know, uh, real question: how would you destroy an entire people? Think about it. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not only killing millions of individuals, though it is certainly that, and it's not only degrading their culture, their way of life, though it's certainly also that. But to destroy a people, you have to you have to wipe out every trace, the slightest possible trace of their existence. You have to destroy all the evidence. Not only that they ever lived, but also they have ever died. Within the war, in one of the camps I was in, our job was just to dig up the corpses of those whom the Germans had killed earlier. This happened in many of the places where they didn't have the crematoria. There were mass graves, huge burial trenches, all over Poland and Russia and the Baltics. These people had been shot or gassed or just buried up. Yeah, they didn't want to waste bullets. Little children, especially, were often buried alive. So our job was to dig up corpses. And the German and Ukrainian guards screamed and beat us while we piled the bodies onto huge piles. And then they poured gasoline on the bodies and set them on fire. In this camp, even burning the bodies was not the end. They also took the gravestones from the Jewish crematorium in the area. And many of the stones they had us break up to turn into gravel, to use to pave the muddy roads, and some were brought into the stone platforms like workbenches when we were burning the bodies. After the bodies were burned, we have to collect all the ashes and put them on the workbenches on the gravestone. And if there any large piece of bone or even little pieces, the SS made us grind them up. We had other pieces of stone of the gravestone, so we were able to grind all the pieces of bone into a fine grey powder. The chief SS officer had a sieve in his carried, and all the prisoners had to bring him the ashes they had ground up. All the remains of the people had to be able to pass through the sieve. At the end, the gravestones that we were using as workbenches were also ground up, and the gravel and the ashes were mixed together with sand and spread around the soil. Then more soil was added over that, and grass seed was laid down. After a few weeks, the grass started coming up. It looked just like any other meadow. There was no sign that anything unusual had ever happened there. And how the Germans, and that's how the Germans murdered the murder of my people, and how we buried the cemetery. Now, Raki, please continue from your portion. So, Raki, are you there?
Yes, yes. Dolls. All the day on Crystal was decapitated my dolls. I had a wonderful collection. I was a little girl who loved all her dolls. And we were lucky. Somebody warned us they were coming. When we returned to the apartment, the dolls were sitting together, leaning against each other on our dining table, and their heads were all cut off. My husband and I went back to my hometown in November 88, and we had a wonderful time. Truly, it was totally damaged. The people couldn't have been nicer. They were glad to see us, This was for 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht. They invited all the Jews from my hometown who had survived, and they had an exhibit called All the Jewish People Around the World with a big chart that looked just like my son's in our basement. He is called Sea Mammals of the World. All the seals and whales and tortoises in the place where they live. In my hometown has all the Jewish people around the world. The Israeli Jews wore little kibbutz hats, and the Russian Jews have violins. The American Jews had round and happy faces, and the Argentine Jews wore colorful clothes and dolls too. They were selling dolls too. Jewish people around the world dolls. Just like the American Indian dolls we have in this city, in America, all dress up in native clothes. And a lovely little girl came running up to me, a German girl from my hometown, and she had one of these dolls. It was a German Jewish doll. And she put it in my hands and she said, "This is Elsie, and she's Jewish, and I loved her." She put it right in my hands to show me Elsie's and how much she loved her. And my husband turned completely pale. I swear to God, he was absolutely right. He knew me well. He reads my mind. But I didn't do anything. I, I just gave it back. I did nothing at all. I just gave it back. I didn't tear its head off.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, three readers. Um, anyway, it's a great honor. It rarely happens, to be honest, that I allow. I mean, I'm very possessive about this piece and doing it, and who does it? You guys, you all did great. And, um, you know, my sense was you spent a lot of time uh, doing this and preparing, and I met with two of you before. And I really appreciate you doing that and taking the time. And I hope it was good. I know sometimes, just the technology was in our way a little bit in terms of silences and blips and blops and the things that happen online. But I hope at least most of it came through these stories. And as you heard, if it was clear enough, a lot of them too, certainly Mars and Dolls has to do with, again, people not hearing, whether it's the cousin who saw the newsreels, which I heard many times from people, or the last monologue, which was about uh, turning indeed survivors and other victims into dolls after the fact, which is what it's kind of like the New York Times giving their occupation as um, survivor, in this case, not survivors, but strangely enough, one of the things that can happen after you destroy a lot of people is that you bring them back in a sort of sentimental way as what, little figurines, as though you miss them, but not really them, but some version of them as that represents the fact that they once were and are not anymore. Okay. I'm going to ask Palab, I know we're about, how much time do we have? Because I want to make sure there's time if we can set this up for people to raise questions. And I have one little bit I might do, but I don't need to do. Or whoever is, whoever wants to tell me. What do we have time-wise at this point?
Sir, we have 15 minutes left for the, I mean,
For the
this. Okay, and then we will continue to the more 15 minutes for the discussion, question
Okay.
answering.
Okay. Well, I won't take all the 15 minutes to start with, but so we'll have a little more for discussion, which is, as you know, my favorite anyway. Um, but I want to just end with remembering one particular survivor who is not represented in the play, um, but who is someone who is represented in another play of mine, and whom I once wrote two full chapters, about a third of a book about. Um, an important person, partly because he was a very challenging person to get to know, and I will say, for him to trust me. I talk about these relationships, not always so easy. Why would he trust me? I mean, you have to, like in any good relationship, in any certainly interview kind of thing, you have to show that you know what you're doing and that you're on the right side and that maybe you know something already. So this is a guy named Victor who was in a camp, in a death camp called Treblinka, that some of you will know of. Treblinka was, for most of the Holocaust, the most lethal place. And almost as many people were killed in Treblinka as were killed in the much more well-known Auschwitz. The reason that we know relatively little compared to Auschwitz about Treblinka was because there were almost, among other reasons, almost no survivors. Out of almost 1 million people, say 900,000 people killed Jews, mostly Jews, I should say, in Treblinka. Um, roughly, because we don't really know, 70 people survived out of 1,000,000, 1,100,000, so 200,000 more people later, which is, even saying such numbers is crazy, but among Jews, roughly 70,000. So 70 versus 70,000. And also because of when things happen and the different kinds of camps. But the point is that Victor's experience was quite unusual, to even have the chance to speak with someone who was ever in Treblinka, because almost no one was ever in there and got out alive. He did. And he spent most of the war hiding in the forests in Poland. And he was a little older than most of the survivors I interviewed. He was around 60 when I first met him. Most were more like 50. Um, he was also a man who was very secretive um, in all kinds of ways. And I'm going to read, because it's the most efficient way to get through, and tell you the story. But Victor and I met in a location he disclosed to no one. Even his family didn't know we were meeting. He lived in a world of secrets, betrayal, exploitation, potentially by everyone, without apparent bitterness. He shared. Since the Holocaust, I see a lot of races that are destroyed. The weaker has to give under, and the stronger survives. It's the law of the jungle, even by man. This is a world of circumstances. The ant, the rat, the cow, the horse, and the man. This is a world of circumstances. Yeah? Meaning chance, meaning accident, meaning winners and losers. That was his view at that moment of what he learned about the world after his own experiences. Yeah? And for him, I'm reading again, the same Darwinian circumstances and outcome characterized even families, including his own. He said, an old man, full of wrinkles on his face, he's something surplus. Even to his closest, he's something surplus. He is useless. He starts to become a burden. To his closest, that's life. That's part of life. Obviously, a grim view of life. Now, it turns out that Victor holds far more complex and conflicting conclusions and emotions than these bits suggest. As I mentioned, in the 90s, I was compelled to write 2 long chapters, a third of a book, trying to sort it all out. I did that in part because I knew how easy it would be to caricature Victor, as one more bitter or guilty or crazy survivor. I couldn't change that fate, but I thought I could at least take the fight to the caricaturists. In any case, I wasn't initially surprised when Victor foresaw the possibility that I, too, could betray him, mainly by exploiting his story for personal gain. He wasn't against my using what he shared. He only wanted to be sure that if I did, and there was any profit, he would get his share. Now, that's not unreasonable. I mean, I didn't think that there was any chance that the scholarly book I anticipated would make any money. Still, I was glad to sign any contract that met his concerns. I drafted a few, and then he always dodged the issue. In our last interview, this was after meeting intensively almost weekly and knowing we might not meet again, and over a period of about a year and a half, I once asked him again about a contract. He brushed my question aside, and he said this: "It epitomizes what I have wanted to do, what I've aspired to do, over 50 years of sustained conversations with survivors." Victor said, "You study me, and I study you. You study me with sharp eyes. I study you with dull eyes through eyeglasses." I didn't have glasses at the time. But I see that you go in with a sharp mind and sharp eyes. You look at me with eyes that want to find out what is behind my own eyes. I appraise it. I value it. I'm thinking of it. I try to answer with what is of the heart. And you store it. You remember it. I only make the parallel, the connection between one individual and the other. It is good. Now, obviously, I was honored by Victor's comment, but I repeat it here to suggest that making the connection between one individual and the other is perhaps the closest we can come to remnants, awakenings, returns, with Holocaust survivors as with anyone else. It will not solve the world, which needs a lot of solving, as we know. But I can't think of anything that could solve the world without it. I will stop there. So let's learn together. I welcome comments, questions, reflections, anything that may be in people's minds to discuss.
We have just shared with you pieces drawn.
Okay, where do I? Is there a comment section or something like that, or a question section? Where do I find it?
Okay, no side, because it's on Google Meet, so we can't see the conversation. Only with the admins who are joining here, we only see the comments. So we will
Okay.
those questions for you, and we will just recite the questions.
Sure.
But yeah, these fragments are small yet weighty attempts to gesture to the depth of Sir Hank's decades of conversation with the Holocaust survivors. At the same time, Pallav and Rakhi just texted me. We feel it important to acknowledge with humility and apology that our performances by myself, Rakhi, and Pallav could never truly capture the power, nuance, and the humanity that lives in these works. If at moment our delivery felt inadequate, we ask for your forgiveness. What guided us was not skill, but just a small reverence, a deep wish to honor Sir Greenspan's work, and he also gave us the chance to perform. And the voices he has carried with such care. We thank you for receiving these fragments with patience and generosity. And with that spirit, we would now like to move into the discussion
Good.
and question answer session. This is a space not only to ask but to listen together. So now we will take our first question because there are so many questions are there.
Great.
But because of time constraints, we will take five question at max. But before taking the question, I just personally shared something with sir. As you know, sir, we talked about yesterday also. My own family lived through the trauma of partition in South Asia.
Right.
Like so many others, they witnessed how violence, displacement, and loss tore apart communities that had lived together for generations. And like Holocaust survivors, also, they carried those memories not always in words, but in fragments, in silences, and in gestures that only those who have lived through it could fully understand. But that's why I was thinking about from your decades of listening to Holocaust survivors, how do you see the resonance and differences between such histories of survival, whether
Mm.
in Europe or in my place in South Asia or elsewhere? I mean, when we carry our own inherited traumas, such as my family's partition story, as example, how might that shape the way we listen to other survivors'
Mm.
memories? And can
Right.
one people's memory deepen the responsibility and possibility of listening to the
Yeah.
others?
Yeah. 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 It's a great question, and thank you for it. I think it can go both ways, or more than one way, of course. Sometimes um, people feel, that their own history of injury, of trauma, and so on makes them special, and that nobody can compare with what I experienced or what we experienced, and we're not interested. I mean, and that's true. There are such people, whether they're Holocaust survivors or others in other histories, who feel, no, we suffered more, we're unique, and all of that. And then there are people who, out of their own pain, can begin, as you do, to engage other histories as well, and use. I always think of it as like the emotional palette, that we all carry from our own experience when we try to listen well to anybody else. What else can we draw on, right? But our own experiences and our own history and our own knowledge. It doesn't mean that we're confusing our experience with anyone else's. One specific example: there was a time when I was in Montreal, Canada, on a fellowship, and every now and then it was a project that involved survivors of the Rwandan genocide, the Cambodian genocide, the Holocaust, political torture in Haiti, and so people coming from a lot of different histories. I had the privilege of being in rooms, being in conversations in which members of all of those groups, people who've had all those very different histories, would talk with each other. And it was just an amazing thing in terms of learning from each other. And it wasn't, nobody confused each other's histories. Nobody said, oh, mine is bigger than yours, or mine is whatever than you. It's like there were similar questions like, how do you deal with loss? How do I deal with loss? How do you deal with loss? How do I talk with my kids about these experiences? Do you have nightmares too? How do you cope with nightmares? Um, all those questions. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in humanity? All those questions are potentially universal questions. And to hear people coming from very different histories, but finding these questions together and learning with each other and from each other without, again, confusing or competing about whose history is important and less important and all of that, it was just, again, an extraordinary experience. It's sort of, I don't want to sound overly sentimental, but it really was. It was like that. It was just amazing and beautiful to hear how that happened. And again, learning together from each other, um, and again, against the notion that we all have to sort of, you know, hide inside our own particular histories and afraid that someone's going to steal them away or discount them or any of that. It just wasn't like that there. Sometimes it is like that, of course. You're in the world. We know that. But it wasn't like that there. And obviously, to me, that's how ideally it ought to be. But I don't know how rare it is or not rare. In that situation, it was welcome, it was facilitated, and obviously the people who participated wanted to participate, wanted to learn from each other that way. So, I don't know, I hope that answers some of what you raised, but I think,
I
this was,
understand.
this is part of why it was exciting to me to talk about my work there, with people who are there. I said when I was first approached, I had a question, not that I didn't want to do it, but I wondered, would there be interest? Why would there be, necessarily? In what ways? What would people bring? Very interesting to me to know. So, and you've helped me understand. So, good. Yeah. So,
Thank you, sir.
thank you.
So we will take our first question from YouTube, and it's asked by Arnav Rokhit. He's asking that when listening to survivors, in quote, how do we distinguish between preserving their truth and inevitably reshaping it through our own language, memory, and presence? Is it ever possible to, in quote, faithfully carry another's voice, or is the act of listening always also an act of transformation?
Wonderful question. I really am interested to know, but I may not find out whether when that person put survivors in quotation marks. I was very glad that person did, but I would love to know why. In other words, what was in their mind when they did that. But to answer, and maybe this goes with that, yes, no question. And this actually goes with Aish's question. We're always transforming and mediating what we hear and what we represent. And I think that's true not only in artistic products, whether it's a play or something like that, but it's true in all scholarly work as well. I often say, for example, my own academic work, everybody who does this, even if you capture people's words precisely, you're still choosing which people are in your book, or you're choosing which people to quote. I usually say, we all have our quote star witnesses, right? There are many, many, many in my own group, people who survived the Holocaust. I don't quote all of them to the same degree and, as often. So how do we choose which people become our quote star witnesses? Well, some of it has to do with who is speaking in ways that seem to inform what we really want to know. And some of it has to do with what we, the researcher, the playwright, the psychologist, the oral historian, believes is most essential and most important. So I do believe, in fact, that we are always involved in recreating and in mediating what survivors of any of such horrors have to retell. And, I say that I used to feel guilty about it. I mean, I used to have questions myself along that line. Is that exploiting? Is that unfair? Is there such a thing even as the unvarnished, unmediated, pure testimony? I don't think there is. I think it's long, anything we do, including just putting a video camera in front of someone, frames it in a certain way, choosing, and we know from some of the big projects that they make their own choices. There are people, we've learned from some recent scholarship, in each of these projects, people make notes. This one's a very good storyteller. This one, not so much. Right? This is the one we want to feature when we put out our ads and raise money and so on for the project. We're all mediating. And what I think that means, and this is a little provocative, but you've gotten to know me enough to know I'm not afraid of being provocative. I think it means that all of this is in part our testimony, yeah, or it's created together. I don't think that's necessarily. I mean, you can really exploit. You can turn people into puppets, right? To say what you want. And I see this across the board. And we all know people who say, and again, in academic writing, where you put the ellipses, what you leave out, what you include. I mean, you can, if you are so inclined, set it up so you have people say almost anything you want, right? If you choose this but not that, if you leave out this and not that. So there is an issue of integrity always involved. There is an issue of honesty. There is an issue of being as true as you can be to what you think best sense people meant, but inevitably you're part of it. Inevitably, in my view. And I think, in a way, if there's anything good about that, it's that, okay, we're in it together and we're telling this together. It's not all separate. So it's not only to be grieved, but even celebrated in some ways, as long as it's honest as it can be, to put it that way. So
We got the answer why he's using the quotation mark. He also commented.
yeah, did that person answer?
Yeah, he said
Well,
that we sometimes place the word survivors in quotation marks to remind ourselves that no single word can fully contain the experiences of those who lived through the Holocaust or
right,
through partition or any kind of this catastrophic rupture. To say survivor in quote risks suggesting closure, as if we what has endured is now firmly in the past, or as if
yeah,
survival is only about remaining alive.
yep,
But what you show us, survival is not a single moment. It is a lifelong process carried in memory, silence,
right,
fragments, and everyday struggle to live after unspeakable loss. So,
great.
by using quotation marks, I acknowledge the limits of our language and the inadequacy of categories we so easily rely on.
Great comment. I appreciate it, and I totally agree. Yes, in fact, I even say that Holocaust survivor or survival, understood just as described, did not begin in 1945 at the end of the war, or 1944, depending on where you were, because in some cases liberation came in 44. Liberation in the sense that in that case the Soviet troops arrived in eastern Poland and so on in 1944. So some people found, quote, liberation, also in quotes, in 44. However, I think Holocaust survival, if you use that word, happens as soon as you are under the control. So it could be 1941, it could be 1942. If you remain alive for 5 minutes after being under the control of the potential of the perpetrators, the killers, then you survived for 5 minutes. The people who end up still alive in 1944 and 1945 were, for the most part, still there. Not so much because they're survivors and the others aren't, but mostly because of luck and chance and all kinds of things, some of which has to do with physical resilience and other things. But they came to the end of the race. There were others who survived, but they didn't get to the end. But I also, as the speaker, the questioner said, survival is a kind of a euphemism. It wasn't always used. There was a time when people simply said, the nephew from the concentration camp, or the one who was there, or survivor didn't become a thing really until, at least in the US, until the later 1970s. It was used, but it became, in fact, the title of my play comes from an expression that was used in the displaced person camps right after the war, and it was a translation, but the phrase was the remnants that survived. The remnants that survived, the parts of what was once a much larger, fuller world. So that's where the title of the play comes from, Remnants, which is different than Survivors. It's, has its own, perhaps, questions. But to be a remnant of something puts the emphasis on what once was and is lost, rather than somehow you just, not just, but you carry on, you survive, and almost end of story. No, you're a remnant, and uh, loss, I have argued, is the most important experience that is shared by all of the people whom we call survivors, more than trauma. And trauma is sort of everywhere. Everything is trauma, trauma, trauma. Trauma is very important. I'm not in any way minimizing it, but it's not. It's overused in my view. Not everything horrific is trauma, even in genocide. And what's universal, I think, and in a way even less resolvable, is loss. Because what are you going to do? You cannot grieve a world. You can grieve individual people if you're lucky, and that takes enough time and energy and pain just by itself to grieve someone whom you loved, lost, or close to. How do you grieve a whole world, a whole family, a whole community? It's a whole way of life. I don't think you can. A character in another play of mine says this, and then he says, well, the best we can do is we can grieve our inability to grieve, huh? And do it together. Again, it's the solidarity that's important. And to that extent, living with the not grievable loss, but at least, quote, at least having a connection with each other as we do it. This character says, and therefore feel less ashamed about our limitations, inevitable limitations in such circumstances. So, thank you.
Now we will take our next question. Um, it's asked by Piali. She's asking that if silence is often as much a part of testimony as speech, how do we, at witness, learn to hear what is not said without turning silence into our own projection or
Mhm.
interpretation?
Right. Yeah, it's a very similar question, which is great. And on one level, the answer is we inevitably, or we tend uh, to decide what silence means on our own. Usually, and this goes with what I just said, usually, and there are plenty of academic papers that do this, that assume that every time a survivor is silent, oh my goodness, it's trauma. And that's why. And that's far from true. There are many times that people are silent. And why do I say this and think I know? If they're silent, because I asked them. That's why. And look, just because they tell me doesn't necessarily mean that's the full answer. But I've at least learned that sometimes survivors are silent about certain things without getting specific, because they say, because some of the people they were with were not exactly heroes during the war. They did not necessarily support each other. Um, They may, and this is an extreme case, but it happened. Sometimes people stole bread from other prisoners. That was not typical, but it happened. Sometimes people were in other ways did, from the perspective of later, things that they're not proud of, etc. So some survivors are silent because they don't want, especially their children, to know, the children of those people, that this happened, that their parent or grandparent did something. They're protecting the memory sometimes of such people. This is, again, not typical, but it's one of many. Sometimes people are silent just because it's agency, just because I'm choosing not to speak. And we see that in the wake of many other kinds of trauma too. Sometimes not speaking is more powerful than speaking in terms of feeling control. right? Which is not exactly about trauma, but is another way of sustaining control by not telling. And of course, sometimes people don't remember, and sometimes people, or they have no sense that what they have to say will be understandable in a sensory way. For example, it's a silly example in one way, but how do you convey the taste of something if someone has never eaten it? I mean, a sensory experience is almost by definition not communicable in words. So how do you convey what it means to be starving if you haven't ever come close to that, or being beaten, or being exposed, or feeling abandoned that way, or humiliated? All of these things, although the word trauma is used to cover them, these are much more specific than, in my view, trauma. I don't think trauma tells us much. I think that the usual words like exposure, humiliation, degradation, etc., are more useful in our understanding than calling everything trauma. But uh, and then yes, of course, there are always missing pieces. There are always things that we just don't know. Um, in my years of talking with survivors, everyone, including people whom I've known the closest, have told me that there are things I never told you, that I never told, or told anyone. Um, there are always things that are left out. So again, I think the best one can do is just say that and acknowledge it. And we live with that incompleteness the way we live with grief that is ungrievable. We do it together, ideally, and don't try to force an answer that we don't have. Yeah, it takes hard for me, a certain humility to just accept our limitations in this way. But I think we do better when we can. So,
Thank you, sir. For time constraint, we will take only one last question. The remaining
okay,
question I will send you by email. Okay, sir.
sure.
Because there are so many questions left, but we will take only the one last question is asked by Obinandita. She's also asking that what does it mean to carry survivor stories in our own lives, not
Mm.
as history, not as trauma alone, but as something that alters who we are and
Mm.
how we act in the present? How do we live ethically with what we have heard?
Sorry, with what we have, the
Heard,
last heart.
yeah. H-E-A-R-D,
Wow.
heard, heard.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
Wow. Um, yeah. You know, maybe because this goes back to the first question. The people who I really got to know, um, and that survivor I quoted at the end who said, I tell you what's of the heart and you store it, you remember it. To me, it's a privilege. I was very glad that he said that, obviously. Um, I always come back to the same thing. There were times when I couldn't hear. There were times when um, it got to me. I mean, I was speaking obviously personally. Um, and times when I had to not turn away, not in an interview, but um, what helped me, um, and not simply deny it, was the fact, again, I keep saying it was doing it not alone. I happen to be very lucky. I had a very close colleague and friend, like a brother. He's the person to whom the new book is dedicated. And we would meet and talk. We knew the same survivors. He was a historian. And we shared our own responses and understandings of these survivors together. If he were not in my life, I'm not sure I could have done this. It was really, really important to have someone like that. And when I teach it, I also say to students, don't do this alone. It's partly why we do it in class. Um, so it's too hard. People still, I'm thinking now of students, people still have nightmares. Um, during the course. And, to me, that's understandable. And, the course is the kind of course where it's small and people can, as comfortable, share their responses and share the nightmares they have. And then other people share their nightmares. And so again, it's together. It's not paralyzing in almost every case. I've never seen anyone, and it's been in my class anyway, be paralyzed by it. They're pained, obviously, by it, but not paralyzed. So, we move on together, and then I just want to add and maybe end with this. I have very close friends, colleagues, who sometimes almost apologize to me, and they say, I'm sorry, but I can't go to your play. I don't want to go to that movie or whatever about this history because it's just too much for me. I just don't want to go there. I appreciate that. I appreciate that because it means to me they know enough about what this is really about. They know it's too much. That means that's knowing a lot. What's really scary is when people say, and I've heard this too, I love to watch movies about the Holocaust. I love to read books about the Holocaust. That's crazy. Right? I mean, that's scary. That is really scary when people just love to hear about horror. That's really going to the movies in a way that is, well, of great concern. And there's plenty of that, actually, in the world, unfortunately, whether you call it voyeurism or what. So when people cannot go there, I respect it, and it's to be respected. And I think it suggests an understanding that is preferable by far to going easily and carrying it easily. So, yes. So let's not ever, it should never be easy, ever. But
The cinema and the novel thing here also, where I'm belonging there. And they all talked about the pianist, the movie, or the
yeah,
kind of the boy in the striped pajamas. They're all based on the Holocaust, or the cylinder list. And they are saying that the movie is so great. Okay, and I'm just thinking, okay, yeah.
right. There are some movies that are good, I think, but yeah, there's some that are schlock. If I don't know if that's a meaningful word, sentimental, and distortions, in my view. I mean, moral critics, but yeah. So this, yeah,
So before we bring
pianist.
this, I mean, gathering to a close, so I wish to
Yes,
some praise on behalf of the world from the periphery and everyone present here. Our profound gratitude to you, Sir Hank.
thank you.
And your presence with us today has been nothing short of a gift because in sharing remnants of a life among Holocaust survivors, you have offered us not only testimony but an act of remembrance that is at once intimate, ethical, and profoundly human. You have reminded us that listening is never passive, that to truly hear survivors is to enter into relationship of what I can say is responsibility, one that resists silence, honors resilience, and insists of our dignity of voices that the world once sought to erase. We leave this gathering not only moved by your words and performance, but also call to a deeper commitment to carry forward memory with care, to listen with humility, and to bear witness with the courage that such listening demands. We wish you the best of luck for your upcoming book. From the depths of our hearts, thank you for walking with us today, guiding us into spaces of memory that are fragile yet vital, painful yet filled with humanity. We hope this conversation continues to echo across our mind, communities, and across all the peripheries where voices wait to be heard and remembered. Thank you,
Well,
sir.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody out there. I wish I could see you. And if I may, it was a great honor. And whatever questions people have that we didn't get to, I'm both interested in what they are, and do not hesitate ever to be in touch directly. I'm very happy and glad, and this is what I'm here for, to respond, whether in an email or if you want to do a Zoom or similar, and have a good schmooze, as I would say, a good conversation in this format, I'm glad to do that. I mean, this is why I'm here, especially at this time in my life. I'm kind of wrapping up a long excursion. So do not hesitate. And I look forward. Is this program recorded? Is there a
Yes,
recording of it?
sir.
Okay, good. So at least I'll have that. But yeah, do not hesitate. It's really an honor. Peace,
Thank you, sir.
power, solidarity around the world, and
Yes, sir.
especially where we need it. We all need it. Right? We all need it right now,
Yes.
as
Thank
usual,
you, sir.
but even more. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
All
you,
the
sir.
best. Thank you.